to the Back on Track Overcoming Weight Regain. I'm your host, Dr. Alicia Shelley, and I'm so excited to be able to talk to Dr. Daniel Hochman. He is a board-certified psychiatrist and creator of the addiction recovery program called selfrecovery.org. Today, we're going to delve in deep and talk about food addiction. So I know just a couple weeks ago, we had 4th of July. And so we were out there eating hot dogs, out there eating all types of food. And I sometimes wonder if, what is my relationship with food? Is it healthy? Is it not? And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about food addiction and kind of all about it and what are some signs that you may need to seek treatment. So Dr. Hochman, can you first tell us a little bit more about yourself? Anything you want to add?
I'm a psychiatrist and I have a practice where I see patients with all kinds of mental illness. But I should actually say I was on a path that, could have wound up your way in med school. I remember I was in rotations. I liked internal medicine and I thought, well, pretty much every illness comes from lifestyle issues, right? Like what we eat, sedentary lifestyle. I mean, that accounts for almost, by far most medical illness, right? So I thought, well, I'm going to quit med school maybe and, make some, lifestyle coaching kind of DVDs. This was back, when DVDs would have been the way to do that. Then, I did internal medicine and psychiatry, and I thought, well, which discipline is better to do that kind of thing? And then people actually said internal medicine, but I didn't listen. And anyway, I'm a psychiatrist mostly because I love always figuring out why we choose what we do, why we behave the way we do, how we think, how we operate. It just always intrigues me. So that's where all this comes from. But yeah, a big part of my career has been around addiction as well.
Oh, awesome. Well, it's okay. You didn't choose internal medicine. I think I think psychiatry is wonderful. The funny thing is I still do some psychiatry even in my practice. Like you do kind of everything. You do everything.
I have no doubt. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about food addiction. What exactly is a food addiction? Because one would think I need food to live. Like, when is it becoming a problem?
Yeah, so that term is tricky because, if it's heroin or, crack cocaine, it's going to be like, that's clearly an addiction if it's gotten bad because you don't need cocaine, you don't need heroin. Alcohol starts to get a little further towards like, well, you don't need it, but it's also legal. It's very socially normal to, drink. And then you can go further down the spectrum. So food would be like on this total far end of, well, you need it to survive. So you can't call people an addict if they're just like eating throughout the day. It forces you to think, okay, well, what are my criteria for addiction? Because same thing, even if it is heroin, right? It's not only that you use heroin, it's that it is causing some detriment to your life. And so I won't bore everyone and go through. I mean, there are 11 criteria for typical addictions. For food addiction, that would fall under something called process addictions, or another lay term for that would be behavioral addictions. And even those, some would be like really healthy and normal and other ones not. So for example, there's like sex addiction. Again, not as necessary as food, but certainly more healthy and normal than alcohol or, other things. So there's certainly a spectrum of how we're going to think about addiction. So the way I define it and think of it is whenever we are escaping some kind of bad feeling through an object outside of ourselves. So I go by the 11 criteria if I'm charting and, insurance needs that stuff. But as far as my dialogue with patients and helping people understand, what point am I addicted? It's really understanding that I'm starting to use something outside of myself, like my actual being. Like I'm turning outside of me to regulate my emotions now. And that to me is when there's addiction. So for food, right, I don't just say, well, everyone who's obese is just consuming too much and they must be addicted. It to me means they're turning outside of themselves to emotionally regulate. And it doesn't matter your weight, Doesn't matter whether, you're binge eating or whether, it's throughout the day. I don't use that in the way I think of it. It's just, is this person turning outside of themselves to emotionally regulate with food?
So I guess a good example is like if somebody is like stressed or having a really hard time and they're like, I'm not hungry, but let me eat like this ice cream or let me eat, something, even though I'm not hungry. Would that be a good example of somebody with an addiction, even though it may not be as extreme?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd say that would be an example, but in order for it to, and I don't get caught up on the term addiction anyway, by the way, but I would consider that on the path. And so then if it's like every day I'm depressed
Mhm.
and escaping a very enduring state of being, then that could be addiction. But if it's a bad day, if you had a super stressful day or come home and it's chaos and things and you need, same thing with a glass of wine, same thing with all kinds of
Mhm.
stuff. So yeah, I mean, if you have a bag of chips because you're just kind of inhaling it and just trying to get through the day, or have a nice piece of chocolate later, I mean, that's stuff I do all the time. And I actually consider that healthy, right? To not be too rigid and
Mhm.
to give ourselves some breaks. But yeah, if it was every day you felt depressed and you were escaping that enduring state, that's when I would start to call it that.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, are there like different spectrums where maybe food addiction can be more detrimental, similar to like, let's say drug addiction? Like you may take some heroin occasionally or socially, but then eventually, I guess when you said it gets every day, it becomes more of a problem. Is it very similar to that on the food addiction spectrum?
Yeah, we see a lot of crossover as far as, if you do think of typical drug use, let's think of a
Mhm.
heroin addict, just like our
Mhm.
stereotypical drug addict. Um, a couple things. I mean, one, they're generally going to be a lot worse if they have friends who they use with. And also, there's another archetype of that heroin addict who now just injects on their own all the time in isolation, and they need to, or else they go into withdrawal and stuff. And so they're just, they're isolated and doing it as well. So same thing with eating. We see
Mhm.
people. There's a huge correlation in weight between ourselves and our closest people in our lives, either friends or family, both. So there's a really high association there, and so it's probably not a surprise, right? It's I wouldn't liken it to using heroin, but if you can at least appreciate that, if you're around people who are overeating, always eating, not just finishing a meal, but then going on to dessert or a couple desserts and snacks, drinks with calories and all that. If that's normalized in your close social group, then that doesn't help. And then same thing, we
Mhm.
see, all patients who are isolating and eating, literally just like standing in the closet, like a child,
Mhm.
in the evening often, just kind of foraging and finding things to grab. Um, Similar to, like we say, someone who might drink or use a drug, alone at the end of the day.
Mm, that's a good point. I do have several clients who that's the one thing they complain of. They're like, my husband, he overeats, like it's
Mhm.
tempting. It's tempting, kind of draws you through. Well, are there different types of food addictions or major types that you see with food addictions or disorders? Mhm.
Like as far as styles, or more like the kinds of food, or what are you thinking?
I was thinking like would like binge eating disorder, would that be a type of food addiction or is that something totally different?
You ask a very good question. So now I see what you mean. So binge eating is not considered or classified as an addiction. Um, it's a very particular relationship to food. So
Mhm.
I still would say binge eating is to deal with some underlying distress, like I was kind of
Mm.
describing with addiction. But it has its own unique relationship to food, which, I mean, I do therapy with all my patients, so that one usually involves understanding this love hate relationship with it, right? Like
Mhm.
consuming and being voracious and wanting, and that permission, and then this very quick rejection. And so I would say it's a particular dynamic with food. But and there's huge overlap, by the way. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of overlap in addiction of any kind. So like,
Okay.
alcohol addiction, and binge eating. Very high correlation. So I wouldn't classify them, as the same, but and the symptoms and criteria would be quite different. But they are highly correlated because you're turning outside of yourself to regulate in some way. You're using an object, and so whenever you do that, you're looking for still the same sources. The same sources will usually be at play.
Okay, all right. Well, what type of treatments do people undergo in order to overcome their food addiction? Or before I get to that question, how do I know if I have a problem with food addiction? I guess when is it a problem when I'm seeking outside myself? I'm
Yeah.
seeking food. Mhm.
Yeah, well, most people will present for that kind of thing. Well, I mean, most don't ever present for food addiction, but if they
Mhm.
do, it's because they now, have some medical consequences. So they're not only overweight,
Mhm.
but, finally I've got to take a cholesterol med, or finally I've got diabetes. Finally, I had some heart condition. So there's usually some event that tells them, wait, this is getting out of hand. And I haven't been able to stop. Like I know what to
Mhm.
do to eat healthy. I know I need to exercise, but I can't seem to control it. So people could present that way. Um, but the people who are most, I guess, curious and proactive around it do notice that there is this relationship issue with food.
Mhm.
So they do notice. And so to get to that last part that you were saying, yeah, they'd be, I said, most people aren't interested in any kind of therapy or treatment specifically for like a food addiction or sugar addiction unless they're curious. And
Mhm.
so you don't even need to have, symptoms of, like, say, overweight or being on a cholesterol medication in order to be curious about, hey, I do notice at the end of the day, even though I have no consequences medically, I do notice at the end of the day that I'm losing control. And I do notice that I'm needing this thing to regulate, and it feels
Mhm.
wrong to people. But those are usually very proactive kinds of people who are on top of their game.
Okay, all right. What advice would you give to somebody who's battling with addiction, who's maybe curious about trying to overcome it?
Uh, I always work through a lot of layers. And so,
Mhm.
the surface layer, there's the object of the addiction. And so you got to figure out, well, what am I going to do before I get really deep? So, if there is something underlying that's driving this thing, you don't have to start there. That's the hardest thing to fix, right? Because I'm alluding all the way through this conversation to there's some underlying pain, right? That you're trying to regulate, distract from, numb, escape. So whatever that pain or distress is, that's the hardest part. So I start people off in a couple other phases of it. One, the actual part where you go through with the behavior, and so things you can do for that are things that everyone already knows. Those are common sense things, like try and not stock the cabinet with Snicker bars, or don't buy a gallon of ice cream. Buy, like, these little, tiny serving kinds of, we've got Bluebell here in Texas. You can buy like all these little individual things for parties. So things like that, and troubleshooting, and maybe not telling someone around you what you're trying to do and be accountable. So
Mhm.
that's the superficial stuff that I think most people can kind of sort through. And that's what most rehabs kind of do and spend time on as well. The next thing, then, kind of working backwards here, because there's a pain, right? Let me just back up. There's a pain underneath, some distress. That creates the desire in the mind to escape that. That's completely normal, but that's a craving. So a craving is simply just the mind's desire to escape a bad feeling. And it's only when we carry out that craving that we're using that object and we're getting ourselves into trouble. So I start with the trouble part. I then work back to the craving. So fine, normal to have a craving. I want ice cream at the end of the day, or especially a hard day. But we can begin to challenge that. So fine to want it. I never tell people don't want an escape. I mean, that would just be silly, right? So no, go ahead and feel like having ice cream. But we challenge the idea, do you really need to carry through with that? Um,
Mhm.
And there's a lot to play with there. You know, do you feel like you deserve it? Do you feel entitled to it? Do you feel like it's finally your turn? All kinds of things that you can examine there. Also some, you know, very interesting kind of Eastern philosophies to bring in on that, as far as riding that wave of want and desire and craving, and being able to let that extinguish. So there's some neat work to do with mindfulness there. And then after you look at that phase, well, now you're ready to take on the good stuff, which is like that pain. And you notice I don't say like depression or anxiety, because it's not always this like diagnosable depression or anxiety or PTSD. It can be, obviously, you know, most people know people with like, you know, that have been abused earlier in life, traumas. That certainly can lead to all kinds of addiction, but it doesn't need to be even a diagnosable mental illness. It could be that you're not happy with where you are in life. It could be boredom. It could just be that you hate your boss. You know, it can be all kinds of things that just create this real unpleasant feeling. So all of those kinds of things, then that's what you need to examine in the end somehow. So I would tell anybody, you know, whether you do formal therapy, get on an antidepressant, self-help books, support groups, or just kind of go on your own journey to figure out, you know, what do I do to, you know, get through this. So whatever that is, there's various ways.
Okay. Well, how can somebody stay in contact with you or get in contact with you?
You know, my practice is one way, which is hochmanhealth.com. I also have a program, like you had mentioned, called Self Recovery. So if you go to selfrecovery.org, that's a way to just conveniently and privately go through a full curriculum that takes you through this. So it's a program that's now, we just hit 30 countries today, actually. And
wow.
You know, as an example, I just had someone reach out by email this morning saying, you know, does this work for food addiction? And absolutely it does, because it's getting to these underlying issues. You know, we are not just for alcohol, drugs, absolutely for these process addictions, because they still follow the same path, right? You still have to go through this process I described. So it takes you through that. So that's at selfrecovery.org, and anybody can start that at any time. And then, and by the way, our results are many times better than rehab, because it gets to underlying issues. The results are not just better, but they stick as well, because I bring in very long-standing concepts that I got to learn, you know, as a psychiatrist. So, so that works really well for process addictions. But yeah, other places people can find me at the bottom of selfrecovery.org. There's a couple links to the Facebook group and page, and then we also have Instagram and a YouTube channel as well. So you can find that all at selfrecovery.org.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming today, Dr. Hoffman, and kind of talk to us about food addictions and giving us, there's hope, there's recovery, which is excellent. So, for everyone, those links will be in the show notes. So you can actually go to selfrecovery.org or .com, you said?
Org, you're right,
Okay,
selfrecovery.org.
org. Yeah, selfrecovery.org. And so we'll be able to learn more about or just addiction and how to recover. So thank you again for joining us, and it's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for highlighting this, and you know, from the perspective of addiction. So thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.